Poor Blake Langerman. He gets many a scrape and scratch on his brutal escapade through the Arizona desert. Even if he were to escape, there's no way he hasn't contracted gonorrhea, syphilis, and who knows what else. Most horrific of all is the fact that he's endured this torture and exhaustion in service of an incredibly underwhelming game. Outlast 2 is a case of straight-to-DVD sequel syndrome, an idea I completely stole from Noah Caldwell-Gervais' examination of the game, but I'd rather not mince words since he surmised the game perfectly this way. Plus I'm one to riff on a good metaphor, especially one that alludes to Outlast 2's heritage as an ode to the found footage film. However, I'm not necessarily inclined to focus entirely on Outlast 2's artistic mode. Rather, the focus in this video is on how the game's failings as a sequel lie within both its mishandling of thematic content and in its mechanical design compared of course to the first game. What was with that original game? If I had to describe Outlast in a single word, it'd be intense. As a horror game, the primary emotion it would fish from the player was a sense of panic. Claustrophobic, maze-like levels made for an environment you couldn't really trust. Turning a corner would be a point of tension, you never knew what could be around it. Being chased might lead to a dead end, hiding from inmates was a matter of holding your breath inches away from them discovering you. You were locked in, forced to always be up front with and face every threat. And without any way to actively deal with the enemies, an intense feeling of panic would ensue whenever a deadly situation was sprung on you. It was lean, and certainly mean, which is what made it so memorable. A switch to an outdoor setting for the sequel then might call for a twist to the formula. More interesting is the idea. A helicopter crash, stranded out in the middle of nowhere, cultists stalk your every move. It's familiar genre fare, but so was the first Outlast. Insane Asylum is a prototypical horror setting, but it was how that original game pulled from the unexpected areas of all of its inspirations that made it stand above its individual parts, mashing up an odd colour collage out of all those pieces. Less interesting for Outlast 2 is its execution. Yes, it has a trove of inspiration behind it, but the game pretty much just stops at its cliches, and really this is the first hurdle it cannot overcome. Surprise, subversion, and a good unexpected shock are three S's that I admittedly just pulled from thin air. They also describe the beats of the first Outlast pretty well. Outlast 2 never manages to hit upon any of these though. Case in point, how many times have you consumed a piece of horror media where the core thematic principles of the narrative revolve around the idea of fearing folks from outside the domain of urban society? It's a pretty common theme, coined by Carol Clover as urbanoia. To elaborate further, it's the idea that what lies outside the domain of modern populated cityscapes must be feared by those who live within it. Urbanoia is essentially an extension, or perhaps a localization of, the fear of the other. Except in a decent amount of cases, instead of being far off in exotic lands, these fears remain regional. For reference, think of the typical portrayal of the country hick. Deliverance, The Hills Have Eyes, Wrong Turn, all perpetuate the idea of backwards locals being harmful to the typically middle-class inner-city newcomers who have ventured onto their land. Outlast 2 plays in this park. For the majority of the game, most enemies are these rural Arizona locals who aren't visually monstrous at all. They're just people, but of course because they're out in the desert, they're crazy. As a place to start, it's not bad, and that's just the point. It's a place to start, but the game wants to remain there. Consider the 1973 film The Wicker Man. Thematically, it is akin to Outlast 2, but how the two handle their respective content is vastly different. The inhabitants of the pagan island in The Wicker Man are unnervingly regular. Aside from adhering to an unfamiliar belief system, they have schools, run shops, and even chill at the pub when the day's over. Most obvious of all, they never directly threaten Detective Howie, the protagonist, and our Cypher into their world. The viewer gets time to absorb what the average life is for these people. Sure, it all ends tits up for Howie, but you're given equal ground with the locals and a chance at insight into their culture. This surprisingly level-headed approach actually drives the viewer to suspect everyone and everything around Howie, making for an anxious experience. Outlast 2 has none of this. It forgoes a means of any narrative anticipation for an experience driven by the moment-to-moment attempts at shock horror. From pretty much the get-go, the cultists are after you. They whisper inhumane thoughts just loud enough for you to hear them as they stalk you through the brush. No primary focus is given to seeing the cult operate, for you to not only understand their beliefs, but why they adhere to them. Instead, notes scattered around allude to circumstances of unchecked brutality and cruelty, but it reads like extremity for extremity's sake. The people of the cult hold unrealistically callous values that sit in only one dimension. What can only be described as a deus ex machina of narrative justification lies within the contents of a hidden note that wavers off the dumb-sided betrayal seen in the game. It's a Murkov experiment, says Outlast 2. Bullshit, says I. This isn't to say the game had to be the Wicker Man, far from it. What it is to say, however, is that Outlast 2 should have looked at the successes of what it was thematically adjoined to and pulled what worked about those texts into its own territory as a piece of interactive media. You know, like the first game did. Following on from a game where you were literally strapped balls naked aligned to a buzzsaw was never going to be an easy time. The bar for utter helpless terror was raised to an unprecedented all-time high, not only for the series but games as a whole. To hit or even surpass the bar for squeamishness that the original set is a challenge that should be acknowledged as nothing less than enormous. Outlast 2 doesn't stretch for such heights though. It can't, and that's what looks to be the game's smartest ethos. That is until you see where Red Barrel's decided to go instead. The game dishes out a more consistent set of gory images to compensate for the lack of more defined set-piece scares. A mass grave of scorched, dead children is certainly a frightening and truly disgusting concept, but not when it's wheeled into the first 10 minutes of the game. Placed here, it comes across as absurd, more so when you're forced to walk over the corpses and trigger the sound of crunching bones. It is wildly silly. There's no build to this, no craft given to making you dread the moment. It's just an image, an idea, something that is conceptually horrific that is shown to you, but without proper handling and implementation, it just sits there as edgy set dressing. This applies to most of the gore in the game. You are rarely in the threat of it yourself. The scene with Miles in the original game having his fingers cut off by the surgeon is effective because you are there with him, both helpless and not in control. The Eddie Gluskin sequence worked as a series of beats. It implied the threat, showed you the consequences, and then put you in the terrible seat of it. When Outlast 2 decides to finally put upon you a dire scenario, the results are laughable. Exhibit A, the crucifixion scene. Now I have no comparison to make that hasn't already been made of Laird Byron, so I'll just have to repeat the common observation that in the middle of this serious horror game where the cultists that pursue you burn their newborn babies, skin people alive and keep women bound and chained in order to be raped, sits Master fucking Blaster from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. You are crucified by a little person who rides atop a hunchback giant and there's no other option but to just laugh. Laugh at the game, laugh at this scene, laugh at everything that came before and that will come after. This is the moment that will tip you off, if nothing else did, to the fact that Outlast 2 is so disconnected from its own content that it thinks that a scene like this should have come with even an ocean's distance of the game. To attempt to evoke disgust through the puerile handling of genuinely nasty ideas and then throw this scene in, is Outlast reaching a new bar for ignorance rather than intensity. You escape within seconds, and the scene is left inconsequential, and so is another moment also with Byron, where they bury you alive. Again, it's something conceptually terrifying, but not here, because after Master Blaster does yet another half-assed job, you literally push your way out of a grave shallower than the game's script. These are truly jaw-dropping moments for all the wrong reasons. There's a sense that Red Barrels had to tick boxes of expectations set by the first game, that there had to be these moments of torture for your character, but by forcing them in, they become pantomime, ludicrous and absurdist pantomime. Contrasting with Absurdity is Familiarity, but it's a tone that's just as detrimental to the experience of Outlast 2. The minimalist approach to the mechanics of Outlast was in kinship to the original's environment. What gameplay changes should have come with the alteration of setting in the sequel never arrive. Therefore the game feels just like the first, despite the large shift in location. This essentially means the natural looking environments have to bend to the capabilities of the player, and so they exude an artifice, the sense that they're merely glorified corridors and linear pathways built solely for Blake's journey. This has the knock-on effect of the player essentially being able to game the game, because they have a firm understanding of its boundaries. All you need to do in Outlast 2 is run. Just sprint forward and never stop. On a normal difficulty, you can run past enemies just fine, and so any intended cat and mouse interactions are set aflame by the player's confidence with the simple mechanics at hand. And although the levels are linear, there's generally more space for you to exploit pathfinding and AI. You know to hide in a locker and the scary man will go away. That is when the enemies don't decide to wait around for ages, however, because there's always the chance they'll linger in your immediate vicinity for an excruciatingly tedious amount of time. As simple as it is, Outlast 2's gameplay does have a habit of breaking down into defunct headbutting between you and those in your way, because sometimes it's just too much to wait around for the coast to be clear. Nevertheless, when it works, it's still a rhythm, and one that you've played before in a full game, plus DLC. By giving the player very little mechanical responsibility in Outlast 2, the tension from having to adapt and deal with danger in any sort of active, cognitive or pressuring way leads to very little tension being held, and whatever was there fades over the course of the game rather than builds. This is a game that shouldn't be playing in the way that it does.
Lake. Get to the other side of the lake.
If the player knows the beats of the original game, logic dictates to remain scary, a developer should shuffle those beats, rearrange them, or even get rid of some for others, play upon the unexpected. Unfortunately, even in the set-piece scares and scripted moments, Outlast 2 drops the ball again. Familiarity with the developer's methods prevents any feeling that you're legitimately in harm's way. For example, where danger is the sharpest is in cutscenes, ones already established as absurd theatre. But there's a sense of being under the developer's wing when it comes to these moments. Sure, you're getting crucified, but you'll probably find some way out. There's still 3 hours of game left, and what's come before hasn't been so bad, so if anything, this is just a minor setback. Oh no, I'm pinned down by crazy cultists. How's Red Barrel's gonna get Blake out of this one? All in all, these feel like boxes being ticked for moments of brutality we must put the player in the point of view of. To feel safe is to not feel scared, and the scripting and handling of these types of scenes and set pieces in Outlast 2 is that safety. Nothing bad is really going to befall you throughout the game, because ultimately you need to make it to the end. And although they're trying to make it a grim experience, the developers ultimately have your back. This doesn't need to be a paradox that kills the game, however. Again, it's tied up in the lack of mechanical nuance. In Amnesia: The Dark Descent or Alien Isolation, games where you're similarly defenseless, the developers hand you the tools to save yourself. This essentially compensates for when the games have more scripted encounters. By the time a cutscene depicts a scrape of the teeth moment, you've already spent a lot of time as Amanda Ripley working around the alien and creating these moments yourself that you're more willing to invest when it comes to these cutscenes. There's also the idea that events unfolding in a scripted scene may bleed into the gameplay as consequence or spit you out into a different circumstance. You don't even have to look far for a good example. The original Outlast threw your camera away at the worst possible moment, the one tool you could really rely on. And in Whistleblower, you injure your leg attempting to escape from Muddy Gluskin, and are left with a limp when you really need to run. It seems like Outlast 2 teases these sorts of moments that never really come to fruition. Twice Blake stumbles and drops his glasses, leaving him blind. This never happens a third time, yet alone during a moment where you're pursued or hunted. The original game had a sadistic twist ready for you just when you thought things might have been looking good, but Outlast 2 is severely lacking this edge. By not giving the player a different gameplay experience from the original, or even meeting the same level of devilish torment, it leaves them in a clockwork routine where nothing is a surprise and everything lacks impact. This devolves into a more passive experience, which leads to a disconnect between you and the game, which then in turn leads to questions. Questions a game like Outlast 2 does not need thrown at it, such as why isn't Blake defending himself? It's no good to just label him as not a fighter. Given his life or death situation and evident exposure to potential weapons, why is Blake not interested in doing the most to preserve his health exactly? I'd pass this type of assessment as a reductive assault if applied to the first game. The setting does enough to confine you and sell the idea of being in an ill-equipped position. It's an insane asylum after all. There's not going to be many things lying around for the inmates to potentially turn and rebel against their oppressors with. In the farmlands, shed and homes and wilderness of Outlast 2 setting, is the player really meant to believe that their options are as limited? And here we are, down a logic rabbit hole rather than engaging with the material at hand, because that's what Outlast 2 fails to do by being so familiar. It doesn't tie itself together, it leaves itself loose and easy to be tugged at, because the approach that worked so well for the original doesn't so much work here. Up until this point, the flashback segments of the game have gone without mention. They take place in a Catholic high school, playing off a childhood trauma of Blake's past. In terms of level design, the school section is terrible. In terms of tone, it's perhaps the best part of Outlast 2. The flashbacks operate on an almost dream logic. They're not bound to the conventions of the concurrent Arizona portions of Outlast 2. Therefore, a much needed injection of unpredictability works well for the first few times you visit the school. For a short time, it's a reflection of how the first game handled its pick and mix of tropes in an interesting way. A well-worn setting in the haunted school sure isn't original, but its unexpected place within the story of Outlast 2 works as effective juxtaposition against the rural grit of the present tense narrative. It plays well for a limited time, then like most threads of the game, goes on further than it should. It ends up accounting for nearly half the playtime, and as a result kills the pacing significantly. Every time you inch closer to finding Lynn, you're pulled back into the elementary dreamscape, admittedly through slick transitions but muted by less slick design. A sense of vague scripting obscures your path in these sections. A task of trial and error develops when trying to find a door that isn't locked. You'll attempt to open them all until one you swear you already tried is now suddenly unlocked for seemingly no reason. Then it's not long before the familiar chase gameplay dovetails into even these segments. You're pestered by a gory monster, of which you learn to run away from, but then after a moment turn back and find he's disappeared and no longer blocking your path forward. This loop rinses and repeats for the many times you'll be dragged back to the school. All of these design missteps may have been tolerable if Outlast 2 had a strong narrative to house them all in. Unfortunately, it doesn't. As for the plot, you and your wife Lynn head to an unmarked settlement out in the desert to investigate the trail of a recently surfaced Jane Doe. Your helicopter crashes and wife is seemingly kidnapped. Your sole objective is to find her, and you do, not too far into the game. Then she gets taken again, but you won't get to her as easy the second time. Interspersed are attempts to flesh out a surrounding theme through the method of those Catholic school flashbacks. These tell the story of Blake's seeming guilt over losing a childhood friend, Jessica, to the violent outburst of a molesting priest. To say it's hackneyed is to not do justice to the truly underdeveloped way this part of the narrative is not only handled, but also aligned with the primary events, of which there are little to speak of. When the plot remains save Lynn and has no further evolution, the chance for an actual story to unfold never occurs. Instead you chase a goal, find notes that allude to the gross mishappenings and further backstory regarding the cult, then you reach your goal and the game ends. Not a single thread is satisfyingly presented or concluded. Certain cutscenes are also literally just too dark to actually see what's going on. The notes you find are either very long excerpts of cultic gospel, or the explaining of things you never get to see or have a chance to come face to face with yourself in any way that enhances the horror. Outlast 2 is stuck between tenses and can never pull anything interesting out of any of them. Little is done to make interactivity and the first person experience the means in which a theme or story are communicated to the player. That is aside from the recording of certain images onto your camera as a means in which Outlast 2 tries to document itself, but even here it's a rather confusingly implemented addition. Recording halts your momentum entirely. You have to stand and wait for a loading bar to fill, and then a video entry will be saved onto your camera. Blake will then narrate over these clips, giving some sort of context or character insight. However, he never has anything meaningful to say. Couple this with the vague view boxes that trigger the recordings to look kind of silly, with Blake staring at the sky or a random rock, and it's hardly a compelling feature. There's not too much beyond this in regards to the game's narrative content. There isn't even a true antagonist. Sullivan Noth is the poster child of the cult, but appears in person only twice, and you're never given a confrontational moment with him or any of the other villains. They're all secondary, but to nothing that is actually primary, so it feels like a huge piece of Outlast 2 is missing. You might keep holding out for the ending to be that thing, a moment of revelation the game so desperately needs to be injected with, but it never comes. Instead, when the game ends, there's a sense that the writers had a premise with nothing to fill it other than empty calories of gore. Although Outlast 2 does just about everything ineffectively, there's still a firm grasp by Red Barrels on how to make some individual elements work. I was surprised by the first half's general lack of cattle prod scare tactics. You'll often come across an area and its enemies first, knowing that they stand in your way. This forces the player to take the plunge and dive headfirst into risky situations. I appreciated this restraint, and coupled with the well done music, the game can assemble a decent atmosphere at times. It's also gorgeous. The moonlight casts a moody indifference over the environments. Red Barrels clearly have a deft hand with the engine and can craft some seriously impressive scenery. I don't quite buy the character models though, they have that Unreal Engine plasticity to them. However, some enemy behaviours are well handled. There was a particular lady who didn't pursue me but seemed to always follow and would only lash out if I got close. There are a number of enemies that seem schizophrenic in whether they're hostile or not, and can make for unreliable judgments on your part, as someone you didn't expect or even notice could jump you. An odd moment or two proves that given careful thought as to how the player is positioned can generate a good bit of tension and a good, if expected, scare. I'm thinking in particular of following Jessica's voice in pitch black darkness using the camera's directional microphone. It shows that Red Barrels can wield a scene that you can predict the outcome of, but serve it with enough craft to still make the inevitable effective.
And should thy presence bright. I need not fear, if thou are near. Thou art my savior, kind and dear. Quick, the day is done. This way, Blake.
Jess, are you there?
To say the game is categorically not scary would be disingenuous. Despite an overall lacking bite, there's still a base level of unease achieved, similar to how even the most mundane of horror films can still ride a low frequency wave of fear just given the genre we're operating in here. And of course, what's scary is completely subjective. There are plenty of people who find Outlast 2 to be vastly effective, and I could see why that'd be the case. It's just for those wanting the sequel to show the same prowess as the original in handling itself as a piece of interactive horror, the game never rises to the challenge. A piece of horror media should work as catharsis, a building of fear to be exorcised by the end. Outlast 2 has nothing to build, and so it has nothing to release, no satisfaction to be had. It's a shame because after escaping the suffocating Mount Massive Asylum by the end of Outlast's DLC, I felt like I could breathe again. But with Outlast 2, I never had a reason to hold my breath in the first place.